Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the next episode of the show. And today we're going to talk about the Quran and women. So what the Quran reminds us about the gender relations, rights and responsibilities, and also to look at some of the misconceptions and how things have developed over time and mixed with culture and some of the different issues. And as someone who converted, I became Muslim about 18 years ago, and in some ways I feel lucky that I can look at the Quran in a way that's maybe fresh or different to perhaps other people. I come across women, Muslim women who've been born Muslim, who have never really been taught to read and really reflect on the Quran at all. They've been taught it, they know how to read it in Arabic many times, but they don't really understand what they're reading. And this is very common amongst some of the Muslim women in the UK. Not everybody, and of course many people are educated and have learnt properly, but there are people who, in this issue, really just don't see the Quran as a book that they can actually learn and reflect on. They just see it as something that they know how to read in Arabic and have been taught that from a child, but actually what it means and what it's trying to say and how they live their life by it, it's not really something that they can do. And of course we have, cultural misunderstandings, and we have a sort of patriarchal assumptions that are made, and all of this sometimes gets mixed up, and it can be difficult for people, especially I think for women, to pick out what it's really trying to say. And if we start from the beginning, the creation story, and the Quran repeatedly tells us that male and female were created from the same source, from the same nafs, and that there's no hierarchy. When it comes to gender creation, they were created equal in the sight of God. And that the Quran talks about how Eve and Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve, that Eve was not there tempting Adam, that they were actually both tempted by shaitan. They sinned in pursuit of other things. So it's not about Eve tempting Adam in the way that maybe other faith traditions talk about. And that God forgave them and humanity, and that there's no continuous original sin, which again is there in some other traditions. So I think it's right from the beginning, literally from the beginning, we're taught that men and women have been created equally, and that's repeated over and over again. And of course the story is there for us in the Quran. Both judged by the same standards, both have that kind of connection with God in a way that's equal. And in matters of ibadat, worship, there's no difference. And I think so in a summary of that point, we can understand that the obligations and there will be differences, but that men and women essentially are equal when it comes to God. And a Muslim woman is independent when it comes to legal and financial matters. So she's independent. She has her own, and that's not lost when she gets married. There's very much the teaching that women keep their own name when they get married. So a woman actually remains and keeps her own identity. One of the challenges I think for women sometimes is that they sometimes may almost lose their identity. So they're not really sure who they are when they actually go from being single and the father's daughter, and they sort of develop their life and their understanding of that. I think there's not always enough development or help to help women, especially women, to understand that transition from going from being their father's daughter and living at home to becoming married to a man that they may not have ever met properly before in some cases, and how that then relates to their life going forward. And I think some Muslims in this country have recognised that there needs to be a lot more kind of training or workshops or awareness between men and women for both to actually help them. I remember speaking to an imam from one of the institutions here who deal with divorce and looking at marital issues, and I asked him what's gone wrong, because there's more Muslim couples divorcing now in Britain than ever used to be before. I think there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the things that he mentioned was that the expectations of women towards men and men towards women is very, very high, and when they get married, those things are not actually talked about and addressed at all. So when they get married, they're not really sure what to expect. And I think when it comes to this issue about a woman having her own identity legally and financially, if that's what they choose to do, it's something that needs to be discussed. You know, if within a couple, within a home, within a marriage, these issues are there, and from an Islamic perspective, the woman has every right to earn her own money and is legally a person in her own right. But of course, if he doesn't see it that way, or if he doesn't understand that, that can be a constant cause of issues within the marriage. So I think it's really important for her to understand it, but also really for the husband and how they work that out between them. She can own her own property when she's married or when she's single. So the issues of property rights, something that very much was brought from when Islam came. The Prophet was very clear about that, and it's very much encouraged if that's what people can do, and access her own money, have her own properties if that's what works, and if they're able to do that, and if that's something that they want to do as part of their married life. And there's a saying that says that the what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. So from a female perspective, she has money that she can spend on whatever she wants to spend it on. Now, obviously, in many cases, certainly most of the people that I know in this country have developed a sort of understanding between the couple where she has her own money, but also she will be contributing to things that are there about running the home as well. So I think that's something that people develop as really as a way of understanding their marriage and how they fit that in with their sort of family life here. So I think, you know, the man can obviously be financially independent as well, but he will have extra sort of responsibilities to make sure that the home is run properly and that he's financially providing and keeping things running financially. And within the marriage, you know, that obviously has to be discussed and respected, and come to something that's mutually beneficial for the family. Financial issues and debts and problems that are not discussed can be a real strain on a marriage. There's certainly research to say that one of the biggest strains on relationships in modern times, if you like, is financial. In this country, we're going through a period of time where financially things are very difficult for people, and people are trying to, you know, get different jobs, or some people are out of work, and, you know, men and women, and it can be tough. And I think one of the reasons that it's really important that men and women, Muslims and others, have to really discuss this issue to make sure that they are on the same wavelength when it comes to financial matters within the home. And women have the right to work and own their own business, and that's certainly something that we have seen people encouraged to do here, Muslims and other women. It can be seen as a very good option for women who want to still maintain home, have children, but actually want to earn their own money, or actually have a life that they can develop outside of looking after the children in the home. And again, that's something that's allowed and encouraged, and we can look at examples. Of course, the Prophet's wife herself was an amazing businesswoman and somebody that we can all use as a role model. And of course, she sought him, saw good in him as somebody who was a lot older than him, but actually saw something good in him and wanted him as part of her business. And then obviously they also got married. And I think that story as well is a story that we hear many, many times, but I just wonder how common this would be in our Muslim communities. I actually can't think of anyone that's been through this situation and developed that kind of level of understanding and had that kind of arrangement. And I think it's a shame, because it's a really good example for us of how we can live. I think if it was the case that women had to be home, and of course that's a role that many people take, and that's something that, you know, we can support and help each other as women as well. But if that was the only role that women were allowed to have, then of course we would have been taught that, and we would have been shown that. And actually we've been shown the opposite of that. We've been shown a situation where women do have the right to choose, and there's nothing legally to say that women can't work, and of course it's encouraged. So in each country, in each circumstance, within each family, there will be that decision that will need to be made. That's an important one. In some Muslim countries, of course, we do see women being oppressed and made to feel that they actually can't have even any kind of life outside of home, that they don't have their own life, and that really their life is to serve their husband or to look after the children or to serve their husband's family. It's an important role, and we've spoken about this in other episodes, but it's important for women to be made to feel and empowered to feel that they can also have their own interests, their own space. I was reading an article by an imam here a few days ago where he actually explained how he teaches people a married life is that there's 3 spaces. There's the space that the couple share together, not the physical space, but the space within the lives and within the marriage. And then there's space that he occupies himself, and there's a space that she occupies herself. So that might be her friends or her hobbies or interests or her work or sports or looking after herself or meeting friends, and he will have that as well. And then mutually together they do things and have mutual friends and family friends and do things with their own children. And I think that's quite a nice way to actually to understand it, if you can kind of get that balance. Whereas often what happens is, in some cases, it could be that a man has a very good life outside of home. He might be working and have his own social life, and often you see men socialising together in cafes and meeting up and doing sports together. And sometimes the balance is not there for the wife or for the woman. And of course we have situations where women are on their own, so they've divorced and they end up becoming on their own, and they're not married anymore, and they've maybe got children, and that's obviously a difficult role. How does she then develop financial stability on her own and still maintain the home, but still work? And these things are difficult. There's no one answer. In this country, there's a constant debate about, has the sort of movement towards women working gone out of balance now? Is it fair that women financially, they can't survive on one income? Is it fair that women go to work and then have to come home and do a lot more of the chores and the housework and looking after the children than men do? That's a debate that's happening right now in this country and has been for a number of years, and there's no one answer. I think it's an ongoing discussion, and that will have an impact on, obviously, on Muslim families as well. So I think it's something that we should constantly be re-looking at. But certainly for us, I think we are lucky that we have the teachings and the framework that gives us this guidance to show us that we, what we can do, what works. Give ourselves examples from the time of the Prophet. So after the break, we'll talk more about some of these issues and reflect on the teachings of the Prophet and what he said about issues and what the Quran itself says about Muslim women. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to the next part of the show. So before the break, I was talking just a bit about what the Quran mainly says about women and the role and gender relations. And of course, the Quran for us is one of the main sources of our teaching, as well as the teachings from the Prophet. And often I find women especially are not allowed, or don't allow themselves, or not encouraged to necessarily ponder and reflect on what the Quran teaches and what it actually says about their role or their rights, their responsibilities. And sometimes I think that can cause problems, because what happens is that if they themselves are not reading and reflecting, and if they maybe just understand the Quran in a way that's very black and white, or just understand the Arabic and not really know what they're reading, which happens, and I think it has a special impact on women when they don't really know, and obviously on men as well, but specifically when it comes to women's roles and rights and responsibilities and what the Quran says. I think if they are not really familiar or able to read and reflect themselves, then of course people will impose things on them, or men especially, and other women will misinterpret or say things, or say that there's a verse there that means this when actually it means something else. And it's really important for women to have a good development of that, and for themselves, and to really to really learn that. Another source of wealth for women is of course inheritance, and Islam itself guarantees, and it's a very, very important, but actually quite complex, and everyone says, in all of the books you read, and the scholars will all talk about how this isn't it's not one size fits all. It's something that's complicated and needs explanation, but also allows for many different circumstances as well. So it guarantees a share of her relatives' inheritance, specifically based on the link with the person who's died. And so there's all sorts of things and teachings in place to help people to understand and to really work out exactly how much she's entitled to. It does, for example, talk about how a sister would get less than a brother. And sometimes that kind of teaching is the kind of thing that can be taken out of context if it's not explained to them properly, and if they're not explained why that was mentioned and what the teaching really means and what the wider implications of that are. And of course we know that, and as we've said in other episodes, there's more responsibility on men than on women generally to provide. And he would be, if a man was inheriting money, he would also have to use that to support the female relatives and people around him, and children, and also elderly as well. So I think it's important for us to not just take it as a one line and think that that's the teaching, and because that can also be misinterpreted. And from many people from outside of the faith, so people who aren't Muslim, often will take one lines like this and actually say that this is what your faith is, and it's very, very derogatory towards women. And sometimes we don't really know how to defend that, because actually we don't maybe know ourselves either. So again, it goes back to education and helping ourselves to understand more, reading, reflecting, and making sure that we know how things were meant. And if we don't know, we need to ask people that do to help us to understand it. It's a really important aspect for women. And obviously the sort of patriarchal ideas have really tried to simplify this and really tried to make it black and white as well. And that can also be oppressive to women. And in some cases, Muslim women don't receive their fair share of inheritance. There are cases that are widely known where brothers, for example, are told that they can take their sister's inheritance and never have to, have no responsibility. And this is happening. This is happening. And part of the reason it will be happening is because women and men, but women, especially in this context, are not necessarily aware of what their rights are, and not necessarily aware of how much they can question. So I think some cases women will feel that things are unjust, or that there's injustice being put on them, but they wouldn't necessarily know how to question or what to. And again, it comes back down to their own personal education and finding out what these teachings really mean, and not allowing others to tell us something without us really knowing how we can answer that. And just really kind of towards the end, really trying to think about the basic principles of gender relationships and what is mentioned in the Quran about that. Again, a very, very important area, not just in husband and wife relationships, but in relationships with other people in your wider family, but also in the workplace, at university. And I think the basics that we've mentioned a few times already is about that real basic that men and women were created equally from the same place, and that there isn't this concept in our Islamic teachings that men are somehow automatically superior to women, and that God created humans to find tranquility with each other. I sometimes think of words like tranquility and harmony and respect, and then look at some of our communities and some of the ways that marriages are being conducted, or the ways that people are living, and wonder where the tranquility really is. And I'm sure some of them wonder that as well. And when we see some of these verses and remind ourselves in the core teachings of our faith, it's just amazing and inspirational. And it's about how do we translate that into real life. And that's, I suppose, part of the challenge for us. It talks about mercy, affection, men and women being garments of one another. We obviously have the beautiful example of the Prophet, his life, how he was with his wives. I think it's important for us to try and remember that. And obviously think that sometimes things are not going to be anywhere near what we read about in these teachings. How can we translate those amazing lessons that we learn into real life, into real family life, which is hard, into times where maybe finances are tough, where maybe things are not going as well as we want them to go? How do we deal with those times then? And I think that's something that we all need to be at least ready for. And there's certain phrases and certain words in the Quran which often are interpreted by men to mean that they're somehow superior. This kind of superior nature that men sometimes put over women, to show themselves, rather than translate it as protectors and maintainers of women, would be translated as superiority, especially when it comes to the kind of physical form. And these kind of verses and translations, or really sometimes misinterpretations of words and phrases and context, and are taken out of context, the Quranic teachings, cause a lot of problems in our Muslim families and households, in our Muslim countries and communities, and certainly I can see in my local Muslim communities here in Britain. Although we are a sort of minority here, there's 62 million people here and only about 2 to 3 million Muslims. In some areas of the country, you'll be living in areas where you actually feel that it's all Muslim in this country. And the way that marriages are being conducted and people are dealing with each other, actually sometimes almost goes against what the teachings are saying. And I think it's a very, very sad situation. And because of these interpretations, when it comes to things like women working or developing themselves or having some kind of life of their own that can be absolutely complementary to the life within the family with the husband, can be so difficult to move away from, especially for women who just don't feel that they understand what they're allowed or what they're entitled to. And I also think if within relationships within our communities or within other relationships that are there, if women are just not taught or not educated, they're not going to know what they can and what they can't do. And this, I think, obviously encourages a situation where women then become absolutely, totally dependent on others, including their husband's family, and they don't really then develop a way of being self-sufficient, which is also important. Within relationships, of course, you rely on others, rely on the other person or within the kind of wider family, and of course that's important. But the woman, especially, I think, needs to develop a sort of self-confidence and self-belief in who she is, and how she conducts herself and what her life is about, and how that can then run in sort of harmony and parallel with everything else that she's doing. And the different roles don't have to contradict one another; they can be, absolutely complementary. So I think, in summary of what we've been talking about in this episode, really, just to say that, the Quran in many ways is very clear. It's important for us to read it, to reflect on it, to understand it. And as women, it's really important that we don't just take things as blind following, that we're not just being told what to do or how to believe something. We have our own intellect, we have we need to develop wisdom and clarity on some of these issues and actually learn for ourselves, not just be told, but especially when something doesn't seem to be fitting with the general teachings and ethos of the faith itself. Often we're told that if something is not quite feeling right, if something is not, you're not feeling comfortable, it's not to say that we interpret and make up our religion as we go along. Of course, we would never do that, but it's about thinking, okay, if something doesn't quite sit right with the other teachings of our faith or the way the Prophet conducted himself, then maybe there's a misunderstanding here. Maybe I've been taught something that isn't quite right, and I need to go back and have a look at it. We have no excuse now. There's so much opportunity for learning and for developing ourselves and developing our own understanding as women. And again, it goes back to this idea that right at the core of the teachings, men are not taught that they are superior to women. They're different. Men and women are different, and we've spoken about that in other episodes. I don't need to repeat that, but just to remind ourselves that it's about coming from the same place, having the same opportunities, having being the same in the eyes of God, and having that spiritual connection that's direct. You don't have to be told. You don't have to go through anybody. You have a direct conversation and relationship with your Creator as a woman, and you then have the absolute right to explore and understand and really develop a strong faith of your own that then complements, that works with the people around you, but that is absolutely independent and something that you can work towards and develop as you go through life. Okay, so just always reminding ourselves that we have a role to play, that our roles and responsibilities are laid out for us in a framework that's absolutely, complements others, and that we can work, but that we are our own person, and that we have our rights to our own money, to run our own business, to work. As long as we can make that work within the framework of our faith and not let things go out to one way or the other, then we can live a good life alongside others, but still have our own dignity and respect in place. And with that, I will close and see you on another episode. Assalamu alaikum.